Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're digging into a very specific real-world situation. We're using insights from Pocera, Raymond Yang's Sochi Owechang.
That's right. It's a case study, essentially.
Yeah.
A tenant gets this pretty unexpected message from their landlord about changing rent payments, how they're paid, when they're paid.
Yeah, a big change. So our goal here, our mission for this deep dive, is really to cut through any confusion. We'll unpack what happened, get why the tenant's concerned, and most importantly, focus on the practical steps. What can a tenant actually do based on this source?
Exactly. It's about getting you informed quickly. So if something, similar happens to you, you have a better sense of your options right away.
Okay, let's dive into the facts then. What was the deal originally? The lease agreement.
Right. So the original lease was clear. Rent due around the 20th of the month.
Okay.
And crucially, that payment covered the period from that 20th up until the 19th of the next month. So a specific cycle.
Got it. 20th to 19th. And the tenant was doing this. They paid in May, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. Tenant paid on May 20th, which, under that original agreement, meant their rent was covered right up to June 20th.
Following the contract seems straightforward.
Totally standard. But then, things change.
Suddenly.
Seems like it. The
Yeah.
landlord sends out a message, probably to all tenants, it sounds like,
Oh, okay.
saying, hey, we need to change the payment date. They want everyone paying on the 5th of the month now.
The 5th instead of the 20th.
Right. And that payment on the 5th is supposed to cover the whole calendar month, like the 1st to the 30th or 31st.
Why the change, did they say?
The reason given was apparently it makes management easier for the landlord.
Okay. Easier for them, maybe. But wait, if the tenant paid on May 20th, covering up to June 20th, how does paying on June 5th for the whole of June work? There's an overlap or
A gap. That's precisely the problem.
Yeah.
And where the tenant is understandably confused. So the landlord's logic, based on this new system they want, is this. The payment on June 5th covers June 1st to June 30th. But the tenant's May 20th payment only covered them until June 20th. So the landlord says the tenant needs to make up the difference.
Make up what difference?
The rent for June 21st to June 30th, those 10 days. And the landlord wants that supplementary payment for those 10 days paid by June 5th, along with starting the new full month payments on the 5th.
Okay, wow. So the tenant's basically asking, is this demand for the extra 10 days rent due by June 5th even correct? And fundamentally, can the landlord just decide to do this?
And that question takes us straight into the legal side, or at least the contractual side, based on Raymond Yang's notes.
Yeah.
This is where it gets quite clear.
Okay, let's break that down. What's the core principle from the source about leases?
The source really hammers on this fundamental idea. A contract, like a lease, works because both sides agree. There's a meeting of the minds, you could say. The source calls it Yechat mutual agreement.
Meaning once it's signed, both the landlord and the tenant have to stick to what they agreed on?
Exactly. That signed lease. That's the rule book. It sets out the terms. And in this case, the rule book says rent is due around the 20th, covering the 20th to the 19th. That's the deal they both made.
So when the landlord comes along and says, let's change the date to the 5th and change the coverage period,
Yeah.
they're asking to change the rule book.
Precisely. They are proposing a change, and here's the key point from the source. You can't change a contract unless both parties agree to the change. The landlord wanting it to be easier for them, that's a reason for proposing a change, sure. But it doesn't give them the power to just force it through. It's still just a proposal.
Okay, that makes sense. So how does that apply directly to this demand for the extra 10 days rent by June 5th?
Well, that calculation, that demand, it's entirely based on the landlord's preferred new system, the one the tenant hasn't agreed to yet.
Right.
Under the current existing contract, the one that's actually enforced the tenant, paid on May 20th, covering them until June 20th.
Okay.
So according to that contract, they don't owe any more rent until around June 20th. That payment would then cover June 21st to July 20th.
So the landlord asking for money for June 21st, 30th by June 5th is jumping the gun based on a change that hasn't been agreed upon.
Exactly. It's asking for payment earlier than the existing contract requires, justified only by a proposed change.
So the obligation to pay that extra bit and pay on the 5th, it all hangs on whether the tenant actually says, yes, okay, let's change the lease.
That's it. The source is clear. Without the tenant's agreement to amend the contract, the original terms stand. The landlord can't enforce the new date or the demand for that supplementary payment early.
Okay. This is super helpful. So let's get really practical now. For the tenant facing this, what does the source say they can actually do? What are the
Right.
moves?
The source gives some very clear practical options focusing on the tenant's perspective. Two main paths.
Okay, option one,
Option one, negotiate. Talk to the landlord.
just have a conversation.
Yeah. Acknowledge you got the request, maybe ask questions, discuss it. Perhaps there's a compromise, or maybe the tenant is willing to change but wants to phase it in differently.
Wow.
The point is, it's a discussion, not just rolling over.
Right. It keeps the tenant in the driver's seat somewhat. Okay, and option two, which sounds like it might be pretty solid based on what we just talked about.
Option two is simply to insist on the original contract terms.
To stick to the lease.
Yep. The tenant has every right, based on that initial mutual agreement, to say, essentially, thanks for the proposal, but I prefer to continue following the terms of the lease we both signed.
And what does that look like in practice here with this June 5th deadline the landlord mentioned?
It means the tenant just keeps doing what they've been doing. They plan to pay their next rent installment around June 20th,
Okay.
and that payment covers the period from June 21st to July 20th, just like the original lease says.
So they effectively ignore the demand for the 10-day supplement by June 5th.
If they choose to stick to the contract, yes. Because under that contract, that money isn't due yet, and the payment schedule hasn't changed. The landlord can't legally force them to pay early or adopt the new schedule if the tenant hasn't agreed to amend the lease.
Wow. So really, whether the tenant needs to pay those 10 days by June 5th isn't a yes-no based on the landlord's message. It's entirely dependent on the tenant's choice.
That's the absolute crux of it, according to the source material. The obligation only kicks in if the tenant consents to modify the agreement. No consent, no change, original terms apply. And maybe we can broaden this out a bit. Why does this specific, slightly complicated scenario matter to you if you're listening?
Yeah, it's a really good example, isn't it? It just underlines how crucial it is to, first, actually know what your lease says. It's not just paperwork you sign and forget.
Definitely not. It is the agreement.
Yeah.
And second, this case shows that major changes, things like payment dates and amounts, usually need your okay. It's generally not a one-way street.
Right. A landlord can't typically just decree a change because it suits them better.
Knowing that basic principle that contracts usually need mutual consent to change it gives you options. It gives you standing.
It means you don't have to just panic or immediately comply when you get an unexpected demand. You can pause, check your lease, and understand your position. You have agency.
Which leads to maybe a bigger question to chew on, inspired by this case. If a contract, something legally binding like a lease, needs both sides to agree before you can change it,
Hmm.
what does that tell us about the power dynamic in a rental situation,
Hmm.
and maybe how important real back and forth communication and negotiation are compared to just one side issuing demands?
Yeah, that's definitely something to think about. The difference between a directive and a discussion when you're talking about a mutual agreement.
Got it.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of this deep dive. Drawing these really practical points from Lontertham's notes on rental management. The big takeaway, your lease is a two-way agreement, and changes generally need both sides to say yes.
Absolutely. Understanding that
Yeah.
and what's in your specific lease, that's your foundation for handling these kinds of requests.
We really hope walking through this case was helpful for you. If it sparked any thoughts or if you've faced something similar, please let us know. We genuinely want to hear from you. Leave a comment or send us a message.
Yeah, please do. And of course, if you want to catch future deep dives where we unpack useful insights from different sources, make sure you subscribe to the show. That way, you won't miss the next one.